Sarah Thompson stepped out of her black Mercedes S-Class into the crisp morning air at Elite Aviation Terminal. The clicking of her heels echoed across the polished floor as she walked confidently toward the private jet area. At 34, she had worked incredibly hard to reach this point in her career, becoming one of the youngest senior investment bankers at Goldman Stanley. Today was like any other busy Thursday for Sarah. She needed to be in Chicago by noon for an important meeting with potential investors. Her perfectly pressed navy blue suit and pearl necklace reflected her attention to detail, something that had helped her climb the corporate ladder despite the many obstacles she had faced as a black woman in finance. The private terminal was quiet, with only a few other passengers scattered around the luxurious waiting area. Some sat in plush leather chairs, typing away on laptops, while others spoke quietly into their phones. Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 a.m. She was right on schedule, as usual. Walking up to the security checkpoint, Sarah reached into her designer handbag for her identification and flight documents. She had done this routine dozens of times before at this very terminal. The staff usually recognized her, as she flew out at least twice a month for business meetings across the country. But today, something felt different. The usual friendly faces were nowhere to be seen. Instead, a new security guard stood at the checkpoint, his name tag reading Michael Warner. He watched her approach with an expression that made Sarah's stomach tighten slightly. After 15 years in corporate America, she had become all too familiar with that look. Sarah pulled out her premium membership card for Elite Aviation, along with her driver's license and boarding documents. Her hand automatically reached for her phone, sliding it into her coat pocket, a habit she had developed over years of experiencing similar situations. Sometimes, having evidence was necessary. "Good morning," Sarah said professionally, extending her documents. "I'm flying to Chicago this morning. The flight is scheduled for 9:15. Warner barely glanced at the documents. Instead, his eyes scrutinized Sarah from head to toe, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" he asked, his tone suggesting she couldn't possibly belong there. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. She had worked too hard and come too far to let this affect her. "Yes, I'm certain," she replied calmly. "I fly from this terminal regularly. Here are my credentials and flight details." Behind her, she could hear more passengers arriving. A group of white executives walked up, chatting among themselves about market trends and golf scores. Warner's eyes darted between Sarah and the new arrivals, his frown deepening. Sarah noticed Jessica, one of the regular flight attendants, walking through the terminal. Usually, Jessica would wave and greet her warmly, but today she was engaged in conversation with the pilot and hadn't noticed the situation unfolding at security. The air grew thick with tension as Warner continued to hold Sarah's documents, making no move to process them or let her through. She could feel the stares of other passengers, some confused, others uncomfortable, as they witnessed the scene. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket, probably her assistant confirming the Chicago meeting details. But she couldn't check it now. She needed to handle this situation first. Years of experience had taught her that any wrong move, any sign of frustration or anger, would only make things worse. "Is there a problem with my documentation?" Sarah asked, her voice steady and professional, though her heart was racing. She was used to being the only black person in many professional spaces, but this blatant discrimination at a place she frequented was both infuriating and exhausting. Warner shifted his weight, still blocking her path to the terminal. "We need to verify your authorization," he said slowly, emphasizing each word as if speaking to someone who might not understand English. "It's unusual to see. Well, we need to be certain about who we let through to the private jets." Sarah's fingers tightened around the strap of her designer briefcase. She knew exactly what was coming next, a series of unnecessary questions, additional document requests, and thinly veiled suggestions that she didn't belong, but she had a meeting to attend, and she refused to let this man's prejudice make her miss it. Little did Sarah know, this encounter was about to become much more than just another example of everyday racism. What happened next would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the walls of Elite Aviation Terminal. The situation at Elite Aviation Terminal was quickly becoming uncomfortable. Warner, the security guard, held Sarah's documents in his hands but made no move to verify them. Instead, he began asking questions that had nothing to do with security protocols. How exactly did you get access to this terminal? Warner asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. These private jet services are very exclusive. He emphasized the word exclusive while looking pointedly at Sarah's designer outfit, as if suggesting she had stolen it. Sarah fought to keep her voice steady. I've been a premium member of Elite Aviation for 3 years now. You're holding my membership card right there, along with my ID and flight documents. More passengers were gathering behind them. Some pretended not to notice the scene unfolding, while others openly stared. Sarah could hear their whispers and see them pulling out their phones. She wasn't sure if they were recording the discrimination she faced or calling someone to complain about the delay. Well, we've had some security issues lately, Warner continued, shuffling through her papers without really reading them. We need to be extra careful about who we let through. You understand, don't we? His tone suggested that she was somehow suspicious simply because of her skin color. Sarah reached for her phone, quietly starting a recording. Years of similar experiences had taught her to document everything. Sir, my flight leaves in 30 minutes. I have an important meeting in Chicago. Could you please tell me exactly what additional verification you need? Warner's face hardened. Don't take that tone with me, miss. I'm just doing my job. He turned to a white businessman who had just walked up. Sir, go right ahead, he said with a friendly smile, waving the man through without even checking his documents. That was the last straw for Sarah. She straightened her spine and spoke clearly, making sure her phone captured every word. I'd like to speak to your supervisor immediately. What you're doing is discriminatory and completely unprofessional. Warner's face turned red. Are you threatening me? This is exactly the kind of aggressive behavior we need to watch out for. He took a step closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. But Sarah stood her ground. 15 years in the corporate world had prepared her for moments like this. I'm not being aggressive, Mr. Warner. I'm simply requesting equal treatment. You just let that gentleman through without checking any documentation, while you've held me here for 10 minutes questioning my right to be here. A small crowd had gathered now. Among them was Linda Chen, another regular business traveler who often took the same Chicago flight as Sarah. Linda stepped forward, her face showing concern and anger. This is ridiculous, Linda spoke up. I fly with Sarah all the time. She's here more often than I am. Other regular passengers began nodding in agreement. Warner's demeanor changed slightly as he realized he was losing control of the situation. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. I'm going to need to call additional security, he announced, reaching for his radio. We have an uncooperative passenger causing a disturbance. Sarah's heart pounded, but her voice remained calm. Please do call someone. Call your supervisor, the terminal manager, whoever you need to. I'll wait right here. She checked her watch again, 20 minutes until her flight. Her assistant had taught her to always schedule flights with extra time, precisely because of situations like this. Just then, Captain Roberts, who had flown Sarah to Boston just last week, walked into the terminal. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Sarah standing firmly at the checkpoint, Warner still holding her documents, and a crowd of onlookers with phones raised. What's going on here? Captain Roberts asked, his authoritative voice cutting through the tension. He looked from Warner to Sarah, his expression growing darker as he began to understand the situation. Sarah knew this confrontation was about to reach its turning point, but the damage was already done, another reminder that no matter how successful she became, some people would always see her skin color before they saw her achievements. Captain Roberts walked directly to the security checkpoint, his presence commanding immediate attention. As a veteran pilot with 20 years of experience, he had flown many VIP passengers, including Sarah, and he knew something was very wrong with this situation. Sarah is one of our most valued clients, Captain Roberts said firmly to Warner. I've personally flown her numerous times. What seems to be the problem here? Warner shifted uncomfortably, but still held onto Sarah's documents. I'm just following security protocols, sir. We need to be thorough in our checks. His voice wasn't as confident as before, but he still wouldn't back down. Thorough? Linda Chen spoke up again from the crowd. I just watched you wave through 3 other passengers without even looking at their IDs. Several people in the growing crowd nodded in agreement, and more phones were recording the scene. Sarah remained calm, though inside she felt a mix of anger and exhaustion. She had faced discrimination before, but never so openly at a place where she was a regular customer. Her phone was still recording in her pocket, capturing every word. "Mr. Warner," Sarah said clearly, "in the past 20 minutes you have 1. Questioned my right to be here. 2. Suggested I couldn't afford private travel. 3. Called me aggressive for asking about your double standards. 4. And now you're threatening to call security on me while letting others pass freely." The terminal manager, Mrs. Davis, hurried over after being alerted by another staff member. She took one look at the situation and her face showed immediate concern. "What's happening here? Sarah, are you okay?" Before Sarah could answer, Warner jumped in. "This woman is being difficult about our security procedures. I'm just trying to protect the terminal from unauthorized access." His words came out defensive and rushed. Mrs. Davis looked at the documents Warner was still holding, then at Sarah, and finally at the crowd of witnesses. Her expression hardened as she understood what was really happening. "Sarah Thompson is one of our premium members," Mrs. Davis stated firmly. "She flies with us twice a month minimum. There is absolutely no reason for this level of scrutiny." She turned to Warner, her voice sharp. "Hand over those documents immediately." Warner's face turned red again, but now with embarrassment rather than anger. He slowly held out Sarah's papers, avoiding eye contact with everyone. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward. "I got everything on video," she said to Sarah. "This kind of discrimination is unacceptable. I'd be happy to send you the recording." Sarah thanked her quietly, knowing such evidence might be necessary later. The clock on the wall showed 9:05 a.m. Her flight would be delayed now, which meant rescheduling her Chicago meeting. Mrs. Davis turned to Warner. "Step away from the checkpoint. Go to my office immediately." Her tone left no room for argument. To Sarah, she said, "I am so deeply sorry for this incident. This is not what our company stands for." Captain Roberts checked his watch. "We can delay the flight by 15 minutes. Will that help, Sarah?" Sarah nodded gratefully, but the morning's events had left her shaken despite her calm exterior. As she finally walked through the checkpoint, she could hear Mrs. Davis on her phone, likely calling the security company's management. Linda Chen walked with Sarah toward the jet. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. "That was horrible to watch. I can't believe this still happens in 2024. "Unfortunately, it happens more often than people realize," Sarah replied, her voice tired but determined. "The only difference is now people are watching and recording. It's harder to pretend it doesn't exist." As they approached the plane, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages. The video was already spreading on social media. What had started as a normal business trip had turned into something much bigger, a visible example of the everyday racism that many people still faced, even in the most exclusive spaces. Sarah took her seat on the plane, finally allowing herself to process what had happened. She knew this incident wouldn't end here. Warner's behavior needed to have consequences, not just for him, but to send a message that such discrimination wouldn't be tolerated anywhere, especially not in professional spaces she had earned the right to occupy. As Sarah's private jet took off from the terminal, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The video of her confrontation with Warner had already gone viral on social media. Several news channels were trying to reach her for comments, and her email inbox was filling up with messages of support. Linda Chen, sitting across from Sarah, shook her head as she scrolled through her own phone. "The video has over 100,000 views already," she said. "People are outraged. Elite Aviation's social media pages are flooded with comments." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She hadn't asked for this attention. All she wanted was to make her business meeting in Chicago. Now she had become the center of a story about racial discrimination in luxury spaces. "Ms. Thompson," the flight attendant approached carefully. "Elite Aviation CEO is on the line. He would like to speak with you when you're ready." Sarah took the call in the plane's private section. Mr. James Richardson, the CEO, sounded genuinely disturbed by the incident. "Ms. Thompson, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. This is not what our company stands for. We've already terminated our contract with Warner's security company." "Thank you, Mr. Richardson," Sarah replied professionally. "But firing one security guard won't solve the bigger problem. This happens more often than you might realize, just usually without cameras recording it." "You're absolutely right," the CEO agreed. We need to do better. Would you be willing to help us develop a new training program for all our staff? We want to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." As Sarah ended the call, she noticed more messages popping up on her phone. Many were from other black professionals sharing similar stories. A prominent civil rights lawyer had reached out, offering to help her take legal action if she wanted to. Captain Roberts' voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're making good time to Chicago. We should land ahead of schedule, which might help make up for this morning's delay." Sarah's assistant had already rescheduled her meeting, pushing it back by an hour. The investors had been understanding when they heard what happened. They'd seen the viral video too. In fact, one of them had specifically requested to meet with Sarah, impressed by her composure during the incident. Linda moved to sit next to Sarah. "You know," she said quietly, "what happened today was terrible, but maybe some good can come from it. People need to see this. They need to understand that discrimination isn't just something that happens in obvious ways or only to certain groups of people." Sarah nodded, thinking about all the times she faced similar situations but had no proof. All the times she'd been asked if she was in the right place, if she could afford to be there, if she was authorized to be in exclusive spaces. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her mother. "Baby, I just saw the video. Are you okay? I'm so proud of how you handled yourself. Your father and I always taught you to stand tall, but it breaks my heart that you still have to deal with this." Tears formed in Sarah's eyes as she read her mother's message. Her parents had worked so hard to give her opportunities, to send her to good schools, to teach her how to navigate a world that wouldn't always welcome her. They had prepared her for moments like this, but it still hurt every time. The plane soared above the clouds as Sarah began drafting a statement with her PR team. She decided to use this incident as a platform to address the larger issue. It wasn't just about one racist security guard. It was about the systemic problems that made him feel comfortable displaying such bias in the first place. "We'll be landing in Chicago in 30 minutes, the captain announced. Sarah straightened her suit and wiped her eyes. She had a meeting to prepare for, and now she had an even bigger purpose to fulfill. This incident would not be swept under the rug. It would serve as a catalyst for real change, not just at Elite Aviation, but in all the exclusive spaces where people like her were still seen as outsiders. By the time Sarah landed in Chicago, the incident had exploded across all social media platforms. Her phone had so many notifications that she had to turn it off just to focus on her upcoming meeting. The video of Warner's discriminatory behavior had been viewed millions of times, and hashtag Elite Aviation Racism was trending nationwide. As Sarah stepped into the conference room at Goldman Stanley's Chicago office, she noticed something different. The investors, all older white men, stood up when she entered, something that had never happened before. Their faces showed a mix of respect and embarrassment. Ms. Thompson, Mr. Anderson, the lead investor, spoke first. "We saw what happened this morning. I want you to know that we're not just impressed by your investment strategies anymore, but also by your incredible grace under pressure." Sarah nodded professionally, although inside she felt tired of having to be graceful in the face of discrimination. "Thank you, gentlemen. Shall we focus on today's proposal?" She pulled out her presentation materials, determined to keep the meeting about business. But as she began her presentation about a new investment opportunity, her phone kept buzzing in her bag. During a short break, she quickly checked her messages. Elite Aviation had released an official statement. "We deeply regret the discriminatory treatment experienced by Ms. Sarah Thompson at our terminal. The security guard involved has been terminated, and we are implementing immediate changes to our protocols. We have zero tolerance for racism or discrimination of any kind." Linda Chen had sent her several supportive messages, along with screenshots of comments from other Elite Aviation customers threatening to cancel their memberships unless serious changes were made. The story had been picked up by major news networks, and reporters were trying to get interviews with Sarah. After her successful meeting, the investors had agreed to her proposal within an hour. Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, finally allowing herself to process everything. Her social media accounts were flooded with messages. Some shared similar experiences, others expressed outrage, and a few trolls tried to justify Warner's behavior. Her phone rang. It was Mrs. Davis, the terminal manager. "Sarah, I wanted to update you personally. The security company has fired Mr. Warner, and they're facing serious backlash. They've lost contracts with 3 other private aviation companies today. What did Warner say? Sarah asked, curious about his response to the situation. Mrs. Davis sighed. He claims he was just following protocol, but the videos clearly show otherwise. He's hired a lawyer and is trying to claim he's being unfairly targeted. Sarah wasn't surprised. People like Warner often saw themselves as victims when called out for their behavior. She had seen this pattern many times before. A text came in from her younger sister. Sis, you're trending. Mom's worried sick, but Dad's showing the video to everyone at church. You're giving voice to what we deal with every day. Sarah smiled at her sister's message, but her heart felt heavy. She opened her laptop and began writing a public statement. She needed to address this situation carefully, not just as Sarah Thompson who faced discrimination, but as a voice for countless others who experienced similar treatment without cameras recording it. As she wrote, more emails poured in. Civil rights organizations wanted her to speak at their events. Business magazines wanted to feature her story. Elite Aviation CEO had sent another message, asking her to lead a diversity and inclusion panel for their staff training. Dear Mr. Richardson, she typed in response to the CEO's email. I appreciate your quick response to this incident. However, one training panel won't solve the deeper issues. I'm willing to work with you on implementing long-term changes, but only if you're ready to make real, lasting commitments to diversity and inclusion. Sarah looked out her hotel window at the Chicago skyline. Tomorrow, she would fly back home, but not on Elite Aviation. She had already booked a different private jet service. The incident had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, but she refused to let it break her spirit. Her mother called again. Baby, are you sure you're okay? Yes, Mom, Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. This time, they picked the wrong person to discriminate against. This time, we're going to make sure something actually changes. A week after the incident, Sarah sat in her home office, reviewing the countless messages and responses that had poured in. Her story had sparked a national conversation about racism in luxury spaces, and the responses ranged from heartwarming to infuriating. Warner had appeared on a local news show, trying to defend his actions. I was just doing my job, he insisted, his voice shaking slightly. This isn't about race. We have strict security protocols at private terminals. But the interviewer wasn't buying it. Then why did you let other passengers through without checking their documents? The reporter asked sharply. Warner's face turned red, and he struggled to answer. Sarah watched the interview with a mix of anger and sadness. Her phone rang. It was Linda Chen again. Sarah, have you seen this? He's making things worse for himself. And now his old coworkers are coming forward with stories about his previous discriminatory behavior. I saw it, Sarah replied, closing her laptop. But I'm more interested in the changes Elite Aviation promised to make. Their CEO is meeting with me tomorrow. The next morning, Sarah walked into Elite Aviation's corporate headquarters. This time, everyone knew exactly who she was. The receptionist jumped up to greet her, and staff members watched nervously as she passed by. Some smiled supportively, while others looked away in embarrassment. Mr. Richardson, the CEO, was waiting in his office with several board members. Large charts and presentations were set up, showing new training programs and policy changes. They clearly wanted to prove they were taking this seriously. Ms. Thompson, Mr. Richardson began, we've developed a comprehensive plan to address what happened, but we need your input to make sure we're not just putting band-aids on bullet wounds. Sarah spent the next 3 hours reviewing their proposals. Some were good: mandatory bias training for all staff, diverse hiring practices, and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Others seemed more like PR moves than real solutions. This isn't enough, Sarah said firmly. Training is important, but we need systematic changes. I want to see diversity at every level of management. I want clear reporting systems for discrimination. And I want regular audits to ensure these changes stick. The board members looked uncomfortable, but Mr. Richardson nodded. What else? He asked, taking notes. Meanwhile, across town, Warner was meeting with his lawyer. The video had made him unemployable in security work, and he was planning to sue Elite Aviation for wrongful termination. His lawyer, however, looked skeptical. Mr. Warner, the lawyer said, reviewing the footage again, I don't think we have a case. The videos clearly show discriminatory behavior. Multiple witnesses have come forward. You were caught on camera treating white passengers differently than Ms. Thompson. Warner slumped in his chair. But my career is ruined, he complained. All because of one incident. One recorded incident, his lawyer corrected him. According to these statements, you've done this before. You just didn't get caught on camera those times. Back at Elite Aviation's headquarters, Sarah was wrapping up her meeting. The company had agreed to her demands, including creating a new position, Director of Diversity and Inclusion. They offered her the role, but Sarah declined. I appreciate the offer, she said, but I'm an investment banker. What you need is someone who specializes in this work. I can recommend several qualified candidates. As Sarah left the building, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a young black woman who worked at another private aviation company. Thank you for speaking up. Because of your story, I finally reported the discrimination I've been facing at work. They're taking it seriously now. Sarah smiled at the message. This was why she had decided to pursue changes rather than just accept apologies. Her incident with Warner had opened a door, and she was determined to keep it open for others. That evening, Sarah's parents came over for dinner. Her father hugged her tight. You know, he said proudly, when we taught you to stand up for yourself, we never imagined you'd end up standing up for so many others too. Sarah looked at her parents, remembering all the lessons they had taught her about dignity and perseverance. Sometimes, she said softly, one person's story helps others find their voice. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah was reviewing investment reports in her office when her assistant burst in. Ms. Thompson, you need to see this. Warner just posted a video apology online. Sarah opened the link on her computer. Warner sat in what looked like his living room, wearing a button-up shirt that seemed too tight at the collar. He looked directly at the camera, his hands folded in his lap. I want to apologize to Ms. Sarah Thompson, Warner began, reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. My actions at Elite Aviation Terminal were inappropriate. I was having a stressful day, and I may have overreacted to what I perceived as a security concern. Sarah leaned back in her chair, noting how he avoided mentioning race or discrimination. The comments under the video were already filling up with angry responses. Her phone rang. It was Linda Chen again. Are you watching this? Linda asked. He's not really apologizing at all. He's just trying to save his reputation. I know, Sarah replied calmly. Notice how he says he may have overreacted, instead of admitting what he actually did. In the video, Warner continued. I've worked in security for 15 years without any problems. I hope people understand that one incident shouldn't define my entire career. I've learned from this experience and want to move forward. Sarah's mother called next. Baby, is this man serious? He's making himself sound like the victim. Did you see how he kept emphasizing his years of service, but never once acknowledged his racism? The video was spreading quickly across social media. News channels were picking it up, and commentators were already analyzing every word. Most people saw through Warner's hollow attempt at damage control. Sarah received an email from Elite Aviation's new Director of Diversity and Inclusion, Dr. Maya Williams. We've seen Warner's video. Please know that his statement doesn't reflect our company's position. We acknowledge this was a clear case of racial discrimination, and we're committed to our promised changes. Later that afternoon, Sarah met with her mentor, Judge Patricia Harris, for coffee. The older woman shook her head as they watched the video again on Sarah's phone. Classic non-apology, Judge Harris said. Notice the passive language. Mistakes were made, instead of I discriminated against you. He's trying to minimize his actions while making himself look like a victim of cancel culture. Sarah stirred her coffee thoughtfully. What bothers me most is that he still doesn't get it. He thinks this is about one bad day, one mistake. He doesn't understand that his actions represent a bigger problem. Warner's lawyer had also released a statement. My client has expressed sincere regret for any misunderstanding. He hopes his public apology will help heal the situation and allow everyone to move forward. Sarah's sister texted, This man really said misunderstanding, like we didn't all see the video. You good, sis? I'm fine, Sarah texted back. His apology means nothing to me. What matters are the real changes happening because of this incident. And changes were happening. Since the incident, 3 other private aviation companies had announced new diversity initiatives. Several black executives had come forward with their own stories of discrimination in luxury spaces. A national conversation had started. That evening, Sarah drafted her own response to Warner's apology. She chose her words carefully, knowing they would be widely shared. Mr. Warner's statement today shows that he still doesn't understand the impact of his actions. This was never about him having a bad day. It was about the systemic racism that made him feel comfortable discriminating against me in front of dozens of witnesses. His hollow apology focuses on protecting his reputation rather than acknowledging the real harm of his actions. She continued typing. I don't need Mr. Warner's apology. What we all need, is real change. I'm more interested in the concrete steps being taken by companies to prevent discrimination than in hearing excuses from those who perpetrate it. As Sarah finished her statement, she received another message. A group of black business leaders wanted her to speak at their upcoming conference about breaking barriers in exclusive spaces. They felt her story, and her response to Warner's hollow apology could help others navigate similar situations. Sarah accepted the invitation. Warner's fake apology had only strengthened her determination to turn this incident into meaningful change. 3 months after the incident at Elite Aviation Terminal, Sarah stood at a podium in front of 500 people at the National Business Leadership Conference. The room was filled with professionals from all backgrounds, eager to hear her speak about turning discrimination into positive change. What happened to me wasn't unique, Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. What was unique was that it was caught on camera, and people couldn't look away. They couldn't pretend it didn't happen. In the front row, her parents sat proudly watching their daughter. Next to them was Linda Chen, who had become a close friend since the incident. Dr. Maya Williams, Elite Aviation's new Director of Diversity and Inclusion, sat nearby, taking notes. 3 months ago, a security guard tried to block me from boarding my flight, Sarah continued. Today, I want to tell you about what's happened since then. She clicked to her first slide, showing the changes that had taken place. Elite Aviation had hired their first diverse board of directors. 6 other private aviation companies had updated their discrimination policies. A new industry-wide reporting system had been created for discrimination incidents. Over 50 black executives had shared their similar experiences, leading to investigations at various companies. But the biggest change, Sarah said, isn't in any policy document. It's in how people respond to discrimination when they see it. That day, strangers stood up for me. They recorded what happened. They refused to be silent witnesses. In the audience, several phones buzzed with breaking news. Warner's lawsuit against Elite Aviation had been dismissed by the court. The judge had cited overwhelming evidence of discriminatory behavior. Sarah didn't know about the news yet as she continued her speech. Some people ask me if I'm tired of talking about what happened. They suggest I should move on. But moving on doesn't mean moving backward. It means using our experiences to create real, lasting change. At the back of the room, a young black woman raised her hand during the Q&A session. Miss Thompson, your story helped me stand up to discrimination at my workplace, but I'm worried about being labeled as difficult for speaking up. How do you handle that? Sarah smiled, understanding. Being labeled difficult for demanding basic respect is an old tactic to keep us quiet. But remember this, your silence won't protect you. Your voice might protect others. After the conference, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Elite Aviation's CEO. Their new policies had led to a surprising discovery. Their diverse customer base was growing. Other companies were now looking to them as an example of positive change. That evening, Sarah had dinner with her family and closest friends. Her father raised his glass for a toast. To my daughter, who turned an ugly moment into a beautiful movement. Linda Chen added her own thoughts. You know what's amazing? Warner tried to keep you off one plane, but ended up launching you into something much bigger. Sarah's mother squeezed her hand. Baby, I wish you hadn't had to go through that, but look at all the good you've created from it. Later that night, alone in her home office, Sarah read through some recent emails. A major business magazine wanted to feature her in their Leaders of Change issue. A university had asked her to speak to their business students. And most meaningfully, dozens of messages from people sharing how her story had given them courage to stand up against discrimination. She opened her laptop and began writing her monthly report on industry changes. Elite Aviation's new anonymous reporting system had already handled 30 cases, each taken seriously and resolved properly. Other companies were following suit. Warner had disappeared from public view after his failed lawsuit, but his impact remained, as an example of what not to do and how not to apologize. His hollow apology was now used in training sessions about accountability and genuine remorse. Sarah looked at a photo on her desk, herself with her parents at her graduation. They had always taught her to stand tall in the face of discrimination. Now she was teaching others to do the same. She thought about tomorrow's meeting with a group of young professionals. They wanted to learn how to navigate exclusive spaces while staying true to themselves. Sarah smiled, knowing exactly what she would tell them. Your presence in these spaces isn't a privilege they can revoke, it's a right you've earned. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise.